Dr. Sarah Chen sat cross-legged on the rust-colored ground of Karath 7, her datapad balanced on one knee and an old-fashioned notebook resting on the other. The twin suns cast double shadows across the savanna, and the air smelled of copper and something like cinnamon. She made another quick sketch of the bone structure she'd found, adding notes in the margins about possible age and cause of death. She didn't notice the eyes watching her from the tall grass. The Vexri were the apex predators of Karath 7, standing nearly 3 meters tall with 6 legs, crystalline teeth, and scales that shifted colors with their moods. The galactic community had warned Earth that studying them was suicide. The Vexri had killed 2 research teams from other species. They were intelligent, territorial, and saw most other beings as either threats or food. But Sarah had been observing them for 3 months now, and she'd made a crucial discovery that other researchers had missed. The Vexri weren't mindlessly aggressive. They were protective, especially of their young. She finished her sketch and pulled out her pencil to shade the bone fragment's texture. The graphite scratched softly against paper. It was an old habit from her undergraduate days. Digital was efficient, but there was something about physical note-taking that helped her think. A small chirping sound made her look up. 3 Vexri cubs sat at the edge of the grass, barely 10 meters away. They were each about the size of a large dog, their scales a mottled pattern of juvenile browns and golds. Their crystalline teeth were still small, almost cute. The largest of the 3 tilted its head, all 4 eyes blinking in sequence as it watched her hand move across the paper. Sarah's heart hammered, but she forced herself to remain calm. Sudden movements meant danger. She'd learned that the hard way. Instead, she kept sketching, making her movements slow and obvious. The cubs crept closer, their 6 legs moving with surprising silence. The largest cub approached within arm's reach. Sarah could smell the strange sweetness of its breath. It watched her pencil with intense fascination, then suddenly darted away into the grass. The other 2 cubs followed, chirping excitedly. Sarah let out the breath she'd been holding. Her hand shook slightly as she set down her notebook. That had been closer than any previous encounter. She made a note on her datapad about the cubs' curiosity, their apparent lack of fear, and their interest in her writing. The next morning, Sarah found something waiting at her observation post, a rock. Perfectly round, about the size of her fist, placed directly on top of her folded camp chair. She picked it up, examining it in the early light. It was smooth, possibly polished by wind or water, with veins of blue crystal running through it. Beautiful, but unremarkable for this planet. She set it aside and began her daily observations. Within an hour, the 3 cubs returned. They sat at a distance, watching her write in her notebook. When she looked up and waved her pencil at them in greeting, they chirped and bounced excitedly. The largest one looked at the rock, then at her notebook, then back at the rock. Sarah had a sudden, absurd thought. "Did you bring this to me?" The cubs erupted in excited chirping. The largest one ran circles around the rock before dashing back to its siblings. Sarah stared at her notebook, then at the rock, then at the cubs. Surely not. They couldn't have made that connection. Could they? She picked up the rock and held it up. "Thank you," she said, then made an exaggerated show of examining it and writing notes about it in her notebook. She sketched its shape, noted the crystal veins, and described where she'd found it. The cubs watched every movement with rapt attention. When she finished and set the notebook down, they disappeared into the grass again. By midday, there were 5 more items arranged in a neat line. A twisted piece of metal from some old crash site, a fragment of purple glass, a dried seed pod, a shed scale from what looked like an adult Vexri, and the skull of some small creature. Sarah laughed out loud. They were bringing her specimens. The cubs had watched her collect samples and take notes, and they'd decided to help. It was the most endearing scientific assistance she'd ever received, and it was coming from creatures that had killed professional researchers just years before. She documented every item carefully, speaking out loud as she wrote. The cubs watched from the grass, occasionally chirping to each other. She could almost believe they were comparing notes themselves. This became the new routine. Every morning, Sarah would find a collection of items waiting for her. Some were genuinely interesting, unusual mineral formations, pieces of technology from ancient civilizations, bones from creatures she hadn't yet cataloged. Others were clearly selected by very different criteria. Shiny things, objects with interesting textures, once even a clump of dirt that smelled particularly strong. Sarah documented everything with the same careful attention. She learned that the cubs responded to her enthusiasm. When she spent extra time examining something, making detailed sketches and extensive notes, they would bring more similar items the next day. When she simply cataloged something quickly, they seemed to understand it was less important. The breakthrough came 2 weeks later. Sarah was documenting a piece of ancient pottery the cubs had brought when she heard a deeper sound. Not the high chirping of cubs, but the resonant rumble of an adult vexry. She looked up slowly. A massive female vexry stood at the edge of the clearing, her scales shifting through patterns of deep purple and silver. This was the cub's mother. Sarah recognized her from previous observations. The matriarch of the local pack, 4 meters of apex predator muscle, teeth, and protective instinct. The cubs ran to their mother, chirping excitedly. They kept looking back at Sarah, then at their mother, then at the collection of items they'd gathered. The matriarch's scales rippled through several colors Sarah hadn't seen before. Then slowly, the massive creature moved forward. Sarah's training screamed at her to run. Her instincts told her she was about to die. But she'd spent 3 months learning vexry body language, and something made her stay still. The matriarch wasn't in hunting posture. Her scales showed curiosity, not aggression. The massive creature approached Sarah's notebook. She lowered her enormous head, examining the pages with each of her 4 eyes. Sarah barely breathed. Then the matriarch made a sound, something between a purr and a rumble, and gently nudged the notebook closer to Sarah with her snout. The message was clear. Continue. With shaking hands, Sarah picked up her pencil and began to sketch the matriarch herself. She noted the scale patterns, the way the crystalline teeth caught the light, the intelligence in those 4 eyes. The vexry watched, perfectly still, as if she understood she was being documented. The cubs settled around their mother's feet, watching Sarah's hands move across the paper. When Sarah finished and held up the sketch, the matriarch studied it for a long moment. Her scales shifted through colors that Sarah's translation database identified as pleasure and approval. Then the great creature turned and walked back into the grass, her cubs following after one last excited chirp at Sarah. The next morning, Sarah found something new waiting at her observation post. It wasn't a rock or a bone or a piece of metal. It was a flower, a rare bioluminescent bloom that only grew in the deepest caves, something Sarah had mentioned wanting to study in her audio logs. Getting one required navigating dangerous underground passages. But there it was, carefully placed on her notebook, still glowing faintly in the dawn light. Sarah picked up the flower with reverent hands and began to document it. As she wrote, she became aware of multiple presences at the edge of the clearing. The 3 cubs, their mother, and now 2 other adults, a small pack, watching the strange human who wrote down everything, who treated their cubs' gifts with the same importance as major discoveries. Sarah looked up at them and smiled. "Thank you," she said. "All of this is important. Everything you bring me matters." The vexary's scales rippled through shades of warm gold. In her next report to Earth, Sarah wrote about an unexpected discovery. The vexary weren't just intelligent, they were teachers. They were curious. They understood documentation and knowledge sharing, and they had decided that this strange human who wrote everything down and treated even a simple rock like a treasure was worth protecting. The cubs continued bringing her items every day. Their mother began bringing things too, objects of genuine scientific value that showed understanding of what Sarah was studying. Other pack members started adding to the collection. Within 2 months, Sarah's observation post looked like the galaxy's strangest gift shop, and her notebooks were filled with sketches and observations that would revolutionize xenobiology. The galactic community was baffled. How had a human succeeded where others had failed? The answer was simple, Sarah explained. She'd done what humans always did when encountering something new. She took notes. She paid attention. She treated everything like it mattered. And in doing so, she'd taught the apex predators of Karath 7 that they mattered too. Every shiny rock, every strange bone, every gift from creatures who had chosen to share their world with her. The cubs still brought her things. Even years later, when they had cubs of their own, they would remember the human who wrote everything down, and they would teach their young the important lesson they'd learned, that knowledge is precious, that curiosity is valuable, and that sometimes the most important discoveries come wrapped in the simple act of paying attention to the world around you. Sarah Chen's notebooks became legendary, not just for what she'd learned about the Vexri, but for what the Vexri had learned about humanity. In a galaxy where most species met the unknown with weapons or fear, humans brought notebooks and pencils. They wrote things down. They remembered. And that, the Vexri had decided, was worth protecting.